He's also the director of Access, which is an ESRC-funded project that aims to increase the visibility, the impact, and the environment and the use of environmental social science. And really excitingly, Patrick is going to be the incoming director, the new director of the new Environment and Sustainability. Sorry, the new Environment and Climate Initiative. And this is not the name of an initiative that is about to be presented actually next week at the Exeter Climate Forum. And we're really excited because actually we invited Patrick over 6 months ago before we even had this process started that we were going to be appointing a new director. So we kind of knew something was up where we were hoping. And we're really happy that this is coincided that Patrick could give a challenge at the moment talk and also move into this new director role. So thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you for the invitation, guys. Yeah, so as you can see from the title, have we got people online as well?
We do, yes.
Okay, that's what you remember. And we'll simply curate questions or comments now. Okay, and we've got until 2 p.m.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, as you can see from the title, most of my research for the past 20 years has been on energy transitions, particularly on the supply side, in terms of infrastructures, new renewable energy projects, etc. So most of the time when I give seminars up to here, but I've chosen to do something a bit different today because, there'd be a bit of an elephant in the room otherwise. We know that I'm the director of the new thingamajig, whatever it's going to be called. And so I have been spending notionally half of my week for the past 5 years as the director of this ESRC-funded Access initiative. So I did want to give quite a lot of time to Access today as well, even though Access is not specifically a research initiative. Okay? But I do think it's helpful for you all to see that, and to see what I'm going to say about Access, because it might give you a little bit of a flavour about what might be coming down the track, in the sense of, well, who is this guy? What does he do? What does he believe in? What's he trying to achieve? So, yeah, social and spatial dimensions of low carbon energy transitions. Wrong way, is it? Okay. So, yeah, who am I? Where am I coming from? So, I've been an academic for maybe 26, 27 years. And when I finished my PhD, I'd like everybody to know, let's not get too bogged down in my backstory, but I did my PhD on the conflict in Northern Ireland between Catholics and Protestants, taking a social psychology perspective on that, think about people's sense of history and their sense of identity. I'm very attuned to issues of conflict and identity and intergroup rivalry, all the things which could be handy when you're thinking about an institution. Anyway, moving on swiftly. But my very first academic job was in an Institute of Energy and Sustainable Development at De Montfort University in Leicester. So I was a postdoc with no experience, and I was very young and naive. And I was surrounded by engineers who modeled buildings to be energy efficient. It was a tremendous learning opportunity, but I was also somebody who wasn't particularly confident in exactly what my offering into that interdisciplinary space was, and I was the only social scientist in the building. So it was a really formative experience for me in trying to understand how engineers communicate and understanding the perspectives and expectations of different disciplines towards each other, which has stayed with me. So I've been working for quite a long time now on these issues about sustainable energy transitions, and it's also worth letting everybody know that although you might think I'm a geographer, because I've been in the geography department since 2009. I have no geography qualifications at all, as my wife likes to point out periodically. All of my academic disciplinary training is in psychology. I've got an undergraduate degree in psychology, a master's in environmental psychology, and a PhD in social psychology. So I am kind of interdisciplinary, but not just kind of anything goes. I have basically an embedding myself in those two fundamental disciplines of geography and psychology, and that's because my overwhelming research interest, right since the start of my career, is in this idea of place. So that when I published a paper for my master's degree in the Journal of Environmental Psychology about place and identity in Ireland. So I've always been interested in place, and geographers like places. Psychologists don't really get place too much, because psychologists look at individuals. And so when I jumped those disciplinary boundaries, I realized that if you only stay in one discipline, you don't perhaps realize that people look at exactly the same thing from a completely different point of view with a different set of concepts and languages. You only really know that when you step outside and you find out what's going on. And you can do that through interdisciplinary collaboration, of course, as well. Anyway, yeah, so I guess you could say that my research career took off because there was a lot of interest 20 years ago in how we deal with an NIMBY problem. There was attempts in England in particular at that stage to build onshore wind farms, and they were getting pushed back by communities again and again and again. This was before the government decided that we just won't build any more wind farms. It's too much. So that led to a kind of research opportunities to propose multidisciplinary projects, combining engineers and economics and social science to try and figure out what was going on here. And it did lead me to be quite attuned to, for example, the NIMBY concept isn't an academic concept, it's a concept used in society and in media to understand a very complicated social problem. And thinking about what languages we use as academics and what languages are used by stakeholders in the real world to describe those same things, and how we navigate that challenging terrain when the world uses concepts that actually are not very helpful. And yeah, since 2021, 2022, I've been involved in Access, and I'll say a little bit about the guiding principles. This stuff on the right-hand side is not to try and make me look amazing or whatever, it's to say that I've never been somebody who just wanted to publish academic papers. And that's because when I did my PhD, I had a very formative experience where professors were telling their PhD students, don't speak to those PhD students because they were fighting amongst themselves. Professors, it was kind of open warfare in my department at the time between the clinical psychologists and the cognitive psychologists, and the cognitive psychologists didn't like the social psychologists, and no one liked the environmental psychologists. They were kind of geographers anyway. So you have these crazy little turf wars in a very small pool, which I really didn't get or respect. So I've always been somebody who believed in doing theoretically informed, engaged research and then taking it outside so that people benefit from it. And we know that people don't read our journal papers, so we have to be able to communicate our findings to stakeholders in languages that they understand and develop relationships and make that work, which is kind of where Access is coming from as well. So this is a summary of what I'm going to say. Sorry if this is a bit confusing down here. I start all my talks on my research with this fundamental that we are in a very urgent, very scary situation of what we're doing, both to ourselves, I think, now, and to the planet as well. We seem to have an amazing propensity to enable division, conflict, war, and destroy the environment at the same time. We're really not showing a lot of the best of humanity, I think, of late. And the world after 1.5 degrees is quite a scary place. And yet, I think there is still hope. So the research I've been doing is on energy transitions, particularly how we understand this NIMBY problem of host community objections. And I will have a very kind of narrow, specific focus on the kind of people-place relations dimension of that in my research. And I will profile findings from 3 different research projects which have been funded over the last 5 or 6 years. On different energy technologies and sectors in different countries, and then I will move on to Access. And as I said, normally I would just have one slide at the end on Access just to tell people what I'm doing, but I'm going to spend a bit more time on it today because I think it's fundamental for the new institute. So again, these don't look like they've quite come out the way they did in my laptop, but so the NIMBY problem in a sense is how do we decide what goes where? And even what we need as a society. And the idea that NIMBYism is actually a very unhelpful and even toxic way of understanding conflicts with host communities over infrastructure siting, whatever that infrastructure might be. So the energy transition that we're in, away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy, etc., low carbon energy sources, changes the configuration of systems and landscapes and places around it. And often those local examples through grid pylons or wind farms or whatever they might be, disrupt existing landscapes which people feel attached to. So there is a justice question here about who lives with what. around the energy transition, the low carbon energy transition. Where do these things go? And that can be a kind of a rural versus an urban divisive issue. But it's a kind of a land use planning issue, it's a kind of a governance issue, but it's also an emotional and a cultural issue as well, which I've tried to pick up in my research. So, back 20 years ago, there was a lot of academic consensus that NIMBYism was an unhelpful term. So the idea was, what would we do as academics around that? What would we replace it with? What kind of concepts or ideas would we bring into that fold? And I was proposing that we look at people-place relations, and particularly these ideas of place attachment and place identity, as a way of understanding why people are provoked into defending or protecting their places from harm. With the idea that we think these technologies are good and they're green, we can end up actually harming people and communities if we don't get that development process right. And often we don't, sadly. We don't do it fairly, or we don't do it openly or transparently. And so communities quite understandably push back. So for a long time, my research was looking at the dynamics of place and place attachment as a way of alternatively thinking about this kind of community pushback and avoiding some of the really nasty assumptions embedded in the NIMBY term, which is that ultimately people are complaining because they're selfish, they're only interested in themselves or their house property values. They're ignorant, they don't know, they don't understand complicated energy systems, so we need to tell them they're selfish, they're emotional, we need to talk about the facts to them. So the NIMBY concept is kind of tip of an iceberg, which kind of enables a kind of a top-down process where we will tell them what's good for them, and it will be done to communities rather than with communities or by communities, which ultimately isn't a very satisfactory way forward, because it ends up in dispute, in delay, in complaints. For example, in Ireland, I was brought in as an advisor to the grid company. They tried to connect Northern Ireland and the southern part of Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, with an interconnected grid power line, and it was a total disaster. They're still trying to build this thing 15 years, 20 years after it was initially proposed. And that's worth us thinking about when we think about rapid energy transitions or fast action on the environment, that if you get it wrong, it takes much, much longer because you're doing it badly. You're not doing it with people, you're doing it against people, and ultimately that takes longer than it might have done. So anyway, I'm going to jump forward, and over the last 5 years, I would say, I've evolved from a particular kind of conceptual position embedded in this interdisciplinary term, to some extent, place attachment, into a very human geography specific term called spatial imaginaries. So I'm just going to spend the next couple of slides telling you what spatial imaginaries are and how they might be relevant to understanding these energy transitions and disputes over where technologies should go. So this is quite a lengthy quote here from Davudi, a planning theorist from Newcastle, I think. So spatial imaginaries are deeply held collective, so they're kind of cultural understandings of the way in which people in space relate to each other, or society in space. So even very, very kind of notional ideas about, say, the Cornish landscape, for example, what Cornwall looks like, or the Cornish coastline, is clearly something that each of us has in our minds, but it's a collective thing. It's something that we kind of get through culture, through through images and photographs, and paintings and stories. So we kind of absorb these collective understandings of space and who lives there and who's appropriate to be there. And I guess this term spatial imaginary simply tries to cover all of that terrain. But it's very nuanced around the politics of socio-spatial relations, recognizing that these kind of shorthand ideas we have about landscape or place are contested, and they are underpinned by power asymmetry, so it's not like everybody's got an equal chance to shape the idea of what the future of Cornwall might look like, and it's in landscape terms, some people are more powerful than others, and that's why you've got to be careful about whose voices are speaking and representing as these change over time. So there are three types. This typology has proved useful, just to kind of clarify what this vague idea of spatial imagery is. So Watkins proposed that there were three different kinds. The first are imaginaries of actual places in the world. And I've chosen two quite contrasting ones, Gaza on the one hand, Las Vegas on the other. I would imagine most of us I've never been to these places, but I just need to put the words up there and you will have an idea of what that place is like and who lives there or not, and what kind of environment is there or not, as the case may be. So we have ideas about these places that are transmitted through the media and other places. There are also a spatial imagery, which is a kind of a space, like a rural village or a world city or a quarry or maybe a village green. All of these are kind of types of spaces that we also kind of understand. And so they're shorthands for how we see the world around us. And the university campus might be another generic type of space that we kind of get, or a lecture theatre or a seminar room. We kind of know what these spaces are, who should be there, who shouldn't, what people should be doing, what they shouldn't be doing. That's all kind of shorthand. And then the spatial transformation imagery is simply a type of change that you can make to a space. And it doesn't have to be positive, it could be to destroy the place or to change it. But gentrification, for example, is a process of spatial change which involves trying to uplift and maybe narrow to some extent who feels at home in a particular place. And so these are the characteristics of these spatial imaginaries, and they link back to the definition I've just shown you from Devine. So they're collective, they're dynamic, they change over time, they're multiscalar. They're not just about words, they also help us to, if we think through the lenses of certain spatial imaginaries, they lead to certain kind of real-world changes. So they're both representational and performative in geography and language. I mentioned the power-laden. Othering is something that comes up a lot in the literature. That's when we see space or society through the lens of them and us. And obviously from my PhD days in Northern Ireland, where everything is either us or them, I'm very attuned to that. And I'm really interested in ways of creating a sense of us which don't require us to say, well, we're different from those guys, that's what makes us who we are, which you see around us in the world so much, unfortunately. Anyway, so that's the theory. Then to introduce you to 3 different research projects that I mentioned. This one is basically about shale gas fracking. And we did field work in communities in the north of England. One called Great Aldcar, which is north of Liverpool, and the other one which was close to Rotherham and Sheffield in Yorkshire. That was a project funded by ESRC, a NERC program looking at fracking and shale gas, and we all, I presume, know that fracking was a really controversial energy supply option. There's still people who are fans of it, and who talk about how amazing America is because they've got all this cheap shale gas, which we import, by the way. We don't frack, but we do import it. So that was one project looking at that, and that was a multidisciplinary team that I led, which included geographers, psychologists, and computer scientists. And we did analysis of social media. We also did field work in these communities, and we did a national survey with quantitative analysis as well. So that's that strand of work which led to a number of papers. The second strand of work was funded by EPSRC, this thing called the IDRIC Consortium, which stands for Industrial Decarbonisation. And this middle project is really interesting because it's not about the countryside. Almost all of my research in the past has been about people protecting their landscapes from this big thing, whatever it is, whether it's a wind farm or a pylon. And this is about places in our country which are already heavily industrialized, kind of places you wouldn't imagine living in or going on holiday to. So the fieldwork was conducted in Grangemouth near Edinburgh, in Milford Haven in southwest Wales on the Pembrokeshire coast, and in Ellesmere Port, which is quite close to Liverpool in the county of Cheshire. These are all places where lots of people live in these places, and they've been deindustrialized over time. Post office is closed, the bank has moved on, people have lost their jobs because industries come and go. And there are communities where people live on a day-to-day basis with the prospect of hazard or explosion or noxious fumes. They're surrounded by oil and gas refineries or petrochemical plants. And those are obviously local anchor employers. So what we found in this project, for example, was that people were really proud of the fact that they were in industrial locations. That was part of the heritage and identity of these communities. Whereas if you go to these kind of places and you say, we really should build a high voltage power line in the middle of Sweden, or we should frack underneath this rural landscape near Liverpool, people go, no, we don't want industrialization around here. This is the countryside. And we need to protect the countryside from industry, because industry is bad, or at least industry is bad here. Whereas here, these are places where industry is good, but what we have is a government and large fossil fuel companies saying, we need hydrogen to green our economy. We need carbon capture and storage under the sea or under the ground. These are the energy technologies for the future, and we're going to build them here, so you're going to get them. And people are saying, well, we have people going to food banks who can't put shoes on the feet of their children. Are we going to get any of these promised hundreds of millions and billions going into these new industries? It's not that clear. It was also quite clear that nobody was talking to local people either. There was just a kind of a competitive process involving government and large companies. So that was the second project. And then this third project is a piece of a consortium I'm involved in based in Sweden. And what Sweden is doing is, Sweden is a really interesting country. It's very long. It's a bit like Scotland, I suppose. And up in the north, you have the Sami indigenous peoples, and you've got areas where all the mining has taken place historically, but very few people. So it's seen by some people as kind of an empty landscape. And so appropriate for putting lots of new energy infrastructure with its empty space. We just put it all in there. And most of the people in Sweden live down in the south, in Gothenburg and in Stockholm. The idea, at least, is that these people don't want to live beside a wind farm or high voltage power line. You know, we have to put that somewhere else, like out at sea. And this was a particular flashpoint quite close to Stockholm in the countryside called the Munga-Hamra line, where you had a consortium of people who were very pro-industry, pro-development in a city called Västerås, who were saying, we do need a new power line here. It's part of the national story of electrification and decarbonisation. And you had a whole load of local actors who were saying, hold on a second, this is going to destroy the landscape. We have a vibrant kind of agricultural industry here. We also have a tourism industry where nobody is going to want to come here if you put this line right through our valleys and you destroy this landscape, which we regard as being sacred and important. So you have three different kind of areas where disputes have arisen over the siting of different kinds of energy infrastructures, and we looked at them through the lens of spatial imaginaries. Okay, which is just taking it into that area of, okay, what's going on here? When people argue about these technologies, how are they talking about space and place and people? Now, ordinarily, in this kind of talk, I would spend quite a lot of time talking to you about the qualitative data collection and the quotes from members of the communities and the divergences between different actors. I'm not going to do that today, because I want to have time to talk about access as well. So this is going to be quite an abbreviated summary of findings across these three different research projects. And if anybody's really keen, read these three journal papers that have just come out. But to save you the hassle, if you're not that interested or just want the short version, this is a kind of a potted summary. So number one, spatial imaginaries are or were visible in the discourse surrounding these conflicts across these three different projects, these three different places and sectors. So you can see it in what the developers were saying, what policymakers were saying, and what host communities were saying. So when they argue about the technology, they argue about place and space as well. Where is an appropriate place for it to go? Where is it out of place and definitely not wanted or sought? So you can understand that then these spatial imaginaries are used relationally, and what I mean by that is that if people are arguing over, say, the future of Grangemouth in Scotland, they draw on generic ideas about space in order to understand changes to place. So ideas about space and place are intertwined in the arguments that we saw and transformations, and they're both used to justify but also resist these proposals. So the government are using them. They talked about reinvigorating industrial heartlands. So embedded in the net zero policy are these kind of visionary, bland, quite hyperbolic statements about revitalizing these declining places and making them work again. So there's a view of place there, but also in the way that they're being resisted or at least skeptically treated. So here are four takeaways across these projects in terms of findings. Number one is that there's something that's particularly powerful that goes on when local stakeholders take something that's kind of established at the national level by government at that higher level, and then they kind of rescale it down to the local or the regional level. So that the narrative is something like, what's good for Sweden is good for Västerås or good for this local area. And so it's a particularly powerful argument which connects the national and the local, and it embeds the specific local project, which is being fought over, into something broader at the national level, which is maybe harder to contest, like decarbonisation, for example, or fighting climate change, or even just reindustrialising our country and giving jobs to communities and places. So that was quite visible across the different projects, both in Sweden, for example, and in the UK, around the grid power line project I mentioned, which is a Swedish national endeavour, and also industrial decarbonisation here as well, around carbon capture, and specific places like Grangemouth and Milford Haven. And Grangemouth in particular was a really interesting place to go and talk to people, because people would come to the workshops that we did for local community members, and they quite frankly tell us, if this was the council organising this, we wouldn't bother going, because we've been to so many of their consultations over the years, nothing ever changes. And they were also really disillusioned with anchor employers, INEOS, for example, in Ellesmere Port, for example. And they remember the 1970s and 80s, when those large employers like BP or ICI, they would fund the local football club, they would fund the Girl Guides, they would fund lots of community facilities, and they've completely withdrawn from that since then. Now they fund the British cycling team that goes off to the Tour de France and all the social media, but none of it's going into the local area. And they're like, what happens to us? We feel left behind by that. And they're understandably sceptical about industry coming in now saying we're going to be really good for this area. And they're like, well, we've heard this before. So that's one thing, this idea of legitimating ideas through rescaling and connecting the local and the national through arguments about space. The second thing we found was about these symbolic ideas. So whenever you think about climate change or energy technologies, the idea of this idyllic rural space still holds a lot of symbolic power as something that people can use as a defense against proposals for large technologies that they do not want. So we found this in Sweden, we found it in the north of England in the cases of fracking. It still is quite a strong way of saying this is definitely not the right place. Maybe put it in a place that's already industrialized or semi-industrialized, but don't put it in this pristine rural landscape. Now, scratch between the surface, there is no pristine rural landscape. It's a complete figment of our imagination as well. It needs to be interrogated rather than just assumed. But these ideas about protecting rural countryside, protecting nature from harm from these big technology projects, we saw again and again. And then in the, as I mentioned, the industrial decarbonisation communities, people feeling left out, left behind, not talked to, because it was a largely top-down process led by government and DESNZ in particular, involving large corporate players, many of whom were fossil fuels. So people were understandably sceptical over whether this was really a green transition at all. The third finding is around parochialism, which is sometimes assumed to be similar to NIMBYism. But what we found was that the kind of arguments people made about space and place were not at all only local. So if people are saying, don't do this here, they weren't just saying that. So for example, in our fracking cases in Northern England, people were saying, we can't have this in Britain. We're a kind of a tiny, congested island full of people. But there's places around the world where there's loads of empty space. Look at Australia, look at the USA. Do it there, but don't do it here. It doesn't make any sense. So people were crossing countries, crossing continents, and in many ways making quite dodgy assumptions about, we haven't got enough space here, but in America there's lots of space. You can just do it over there and do it to them instead. So it wasn't necessarily a very emancipated idea about let's do it better, either here or somewhere else. It was more, there's empty spaces and making those assumptions, which is quite problematic too. And then finally, particularly in the Swedish project that I just mentioned, it really came out that it is unhelpful to think about energy disputes in terms of, well, who are the people for it and who are the people against it? Because that's a way too simplistic binary way of understanding these conflicts. And you do tend to get quite a lot of individuals and stakeholders who are determined not to be either of those two positions, particularly when disputes get very toxic. So we found stakeholders who were deliberately avoiding being in that camp or this camp for various strategic reasons, maybe. And so it's just a reminder of the complexity of societal responses to these proposals and paying attention to people who are either unsure or we're deliberately not taking a position, which I think in the research literature anyway, it tends to boil down to asking questions about who are the supporters and who are the opponents, as if that's the only thing that exists in this space. Okay, so that's a very quick, potted summary of those different projects and some of the issues arisen. And if you want to look into more detail around the spatial imaginaries, then you can look around the shale gas project in that paper, around the Swedish power line in this paper, and around the decarbonising one in this paper, which is taking each project in turn with different teams of postdoctoral researchers that I've been working with over the last few years. Okay, you can see the teams there. So, it's just after past. I've been going for half an hour. Now we're just going to pivot to access. So I need you to kind of freshen up and imagine a different world where we think about environmental problems through the lens of social science. Oh, before I do that, this was one of the outputs of the industrial decarbonisation project. It came out of the fact that we realised that the stakeholders didn't really have a language to talk about host communities or places at all. So we decided we'd try and come up with a framework which isn't for academics to think with, but it's actually for stakeholders to think with. And it's a kind of a fusion of two basic social science concepts: environmental justice on the one hand, and people-place relations on the other. So there's usually three dimensions of environmental justice: recognition justice, distributive justice, and procedural justice. And what we crafted onto that was these thematic ideas around place. So one is about encouraging pride in place, recognizing changes to places over time, grounding the benefits of change in the place, building reciprocal relations between stakeholders, engaging visions of the future so that you create a consensus over what 2050 or net zero might look like in a place. And then finally, this idea of unlocking local knowledge. So recognizing that expertise isn't just found in universities or in engineering companies, it's also found in communities, and finding ways to engage which bring them in, which are genuine and procedurally fair. And so we tried to give this to stakeholders in Grangemouth and in Milford Haven and in Ellesmere Port, and I think some of them were interested in it. They certainly saw that it was different. And hopefully it's set within that broader terrain of trade-offs and different layers of government, but we were just trying to provide them with something useful to think with, so actionable knowledge in our own terms. Anyway, let's move on to access, which, as I said, I think is particularly useful to share with you, given the new kind of director role. So, 5-year initiative coming to an end at the end of this year, and it starts with a particular idea of the problem, which is that we have a whole host of environmental problems, and we're not really going to solve them effectively if we don't imagine people and communities and society as part of that problem. And to some extent, I think this is a kind of a language issue, but it's also something to do with our culture, where we have, the body, we have people in the environment. We separate ourselves through the language we use. And obviously, the Renew project has been trying to create that sense of connection and relationality. It's people and nature, and seeing those interconnections. And that's what we've been trying to argue here, is that social science, ideas from the social science disciplines, and methods from the social science disciplines are really, really useful to try and understand and to solve environmental problems of all kinds. So this is an ESRC funded program, and in a way you could see it as almost a kind of a license to be an advocate for a while. Remember that people are involved. Remember that we have lots of ideas and concepts in social science, but they're often not brought in to the room at the start of definitions of environmental problems. Instead, we go to the modelers, or the engineers, or the economists, and then we bring in the kind of people dimension later, particularly when communities start saying, actually, we don't really want this anyway, that nobody thought to ask them first. That's quite problematic. So what have we been doing? Well, I want to start by saying where access is, because access is in a space in between existing communities and systems. It kind of sits across the university sector, which is producing research knowledge on the one hand, the policy environment, which is sometimes demanding evidence and knowledge, not always, but sometimes, and then also the funding communities, particularly ESRC in our case. So you can see these little arrows between these different sectors. And so to some extent, what Access has been trying to do is to kind of enable pathways where people can meet and exchange ideas and develop connections and relationships across these communities, because they don't normally speak to each other at all. In fact, you have a whole lot of different people in policy who are in silos in and of themselves. So one of the interesting unintended consequences of Access has been enabling people in government to be better connected than they existing are, even though that's not necessarily the purpose of Access. But just by putting people in the room regularly, you give them space to develop those connections, which should be happening, but doesn't. The other thing about Access is that because it's a 4 to 5 year fixed term UKRI type grant, you know when you start it that it's going to finish at some point. And we've all been in situations where you start a really exciting initiative, you develop lots of partnerships, and then it comes to an end, and the postdocs move on, and the relationships disappear, and it can be quite frustrating because you don't get that continuing funding. So we've tried to get around that persistent challenge of the funding system we're in by developing strategic relationships with institutions that aren't going anywhere. The British Academy has been around for over 100 years. The Academy of Social Sciences represents all of the professional institutions like the British Psychological Society, the Royal Geographical Society, etc. It sits on top of that. And we've also been working more recently with the Institution of Environmental Sciences, which interestingly is a science body, not a social science body, but they're coming to us because they want to reach out to social science. And so we found this meeting of minds. We've also worked a lot with the Government Office for Science, because they're the kind of engine room within government that is about knowledge, expertise, science, research, evidence. Not necessarily social science, but it could be. And so they've been really useful partners for us. And of course, they oversee the Chief Scientific Advisor Network and elsewhere, which is quite useful to tap into if you want to try and get social science knowledge into particular departments. The other thing which is really interesting about Access is that the nature agencies are in our leadership team. Now, I don't know of any other ESRC or UKRI funded grant where it's not just academics running it, it's academics running it in a leadership team with people from the Environment Agency or Natural England or Nature Scott or Natural Resources Wales. So we have social scientists from inside those bodies, inside our leadership team, working with us over the last 4 or 5 years. That's been really useful because generally academics, and I speak personally here, don't really have a clue how policy works. It's like a big black box. And the inside is very different from what we think it looks like on the outside. So it's been quite a useful reciprocal arrangement where they're quite interested in how universities work and we're quite interested in how government works. And they tell us what's really going on rather than what we think is going on. So it's been quite a fruitful meeting of minds. Right, if you want to know who's involved in Access, as I mentioned, we're a bunch of academics from different universities. You probably can't read the tiny print on that, but the white bit in the middle is our leadership team. And then we have quite a lot of co-investigators from around the university. If you've got amazing eyesight, you might see people like Claire Saunders in there, for example. So it's people across campuses. And then we have wider partners from all around. And that partnership has grown over time. It's been an expanding multi-sectoral network. That's been really exciting. So you start off with 10 or 12 stakeholder partners. After 3 or 4 years, there's 25 of them in the room. And you haven't gone after them, they've come in because they wanted to be part of it, because they've heard through the grapevine that this is a useful initiative to be involved in. This is a picture of one of the first annual assemblies we held. I think that's Claire Saunders there, but I'm not picking on Claire, she just happens to recognise it. But anyway, so what we do at these assemblies is we make them free to enter. We don't charge £400 to register. You don't have to give a talk if you don't want to. But you know that you're going to be put in a space which is professional but friendly, and the food is good, and hopefully the weather is good. And it only takes 2 days, it's one night, but there will be people there from government departments, there will be people there who are early career researchers, PhD students, there will be people there from different universities around the country and different academic disciplines. So you don't know who you're in the queue for coffee with, and hopefully it provides a space for conversations to happen and connections to form. And it's been a really successful initiative over the last few years. We had our 5th and final one last week. How we work is just as important as what we are there. So obviously our mission is to kind of champion the social science contributions, What we've ended up doing is developing these guiding principles which really dictate everything that we do. They should be seen in every activity of the Access program. So basically it's about emphasizing the co-production of knowledge with disciplines, with stakeholders, and that begins with a kind of sense of humility. So whoever we are, whichever discipline or department we come from, we don't have all the answers. We do have to connect and join the dots in a sense, try and create something around that. We also need to do that in a very inclusive way. We need to think carefully about diversity and who's in the room, who isn't, and what we can do to make that more inclusive over time. And I can talk a little bit about how, this is a little bit about how we do that. I'll come back to that in a second. Also, for me, it was really important that we have a very coherent sustainability offering. We're not an initiative which is trying to solve environmental problems by flying our co-investigators to conferences in the west coast of the States or whatever. We're thinking very carefully about what we eat at our meetings, how we travel, what kind of venues we choose, so we minimize our environmental footprint. And we bring these together. So what we've learned is that there are tensions between these different principles that are usually taken separately by research initiatives or universities. And sometimes it might be important from an EDI point of view to allow people to fly, for example, to conferences if they're early career researchers. But you might not want to encourage a senior professor to do that who's already kind of benefited from that over many years. So it isn't just a dogmatic, you're not going to eat any red meat ever again, you're not going to fly ever again. That really just creates animosity, but it might need a bit more nuance than that. So we've ended up kind of allowing people to kind of work through their own situations and try and find solutions through the resources that we produced on the website in terms of convening meetings or setting up a project, holding a conference or whatever it might be. And just a couple of things here which we learned along the way, which is that you don't really get any of this without funding it. So if you don't put money into it, it's not going to happen. In other words, if you don't provide extra funds to travel by train, because it's a lot more expensive to take the train to Scotland, for example, rather than fly there. So you need to think carefully about resources. And so we have put parts of our budget into, say, equity funding to allow people to pay for childcare or to come to our events and they haven't got access to funding in their own institutions. And in the last 6 months, we set up an intersectionality, actually that should be advisory community, because we realized that our assemblies needed to be a bit more diverse in terms of access to people of colour. And this is one of the issues, I think, which is around our social networks. We all benefit from our contacts and our relationships, but sometimes that can be quite exclusionary as well. We need to think how we update and evolve those over time. We've had to try and do that too. What does Access actually do beyond organising meetings? Well, we do tons of different stuff. We have defined environmental social science. We have these assemblies I mentioned. We've run 3 task forces, one on net zero, one on nature recovery, led by Michael Winter, and one currently about adaptation and resilience, co-led by the Government Office for Science and an academic in University of East Anglia called Irene Lorenzoni. So these are policy-facing research synthesis exercises. And if you want to know more about that, come talk to me. ESRC mandated that we have a flexible fund, so we had a grant commissioning exercise. And we distributed £1 million to 14 or 15 projects. But we traced our guiding principles through all of that. And that was really the innovative bit about it. How do you do funding commissioning inspired by EDI, co-production, etc.? And we've written that up if you want to look at that in terms of our resources. We've addressed topical issues. We've got a project running about data center environmental impacts. We've done quite a lot of capacity building. We have an amazing initiative led by Saffron O'Neill called the Leadership College, where we bring about 20 early career researchers together year after year after year, so they grow together as a community and learn and become leaders over time. It's been really successful. So obviously this is a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Apologies for, you're probably all flagging there. I know I am, it's a bit warm. Okay, apologies, but I'm just going to show you a couple of quotes because I think it's useful to ask ourselves, okay, they got £5 million from ESRC. What difference have they made? What impact? Was all of this dialogue or assembly? What does it do? So I mentioned we have 3 task forces. The first one was on net zero and it finished 2 years ago. So this quote comes from a senior civil servant. We could imagine this person might be a chief scientific advisor or that kind of role. And what they wrote to us was that, really, I suppose the stuff in green here is about kind of core fundamental aspirations for access. So net zero is a technological challenge, but it's also a social one. That fundamental starting point for diagnosing the problem is fundamental, and it seems that they're getting that. Talking about early engagement with social behavioral research at a formative stage, so doing that early and then feeding it into policy. This just underlines the value of engaging with other institutions in a kind of strategic partnership way, and then that directly informing policy development, in particular the 2025 public participation strategy that DESNet's brought out. So that's one example of really some maybe tangible impact on policy making. This one, if anything, was a bit of a surprise. So let's think about the nature agencies now, the Environment Agency, Natural England. 90% or 95% of the staff in these agencies are natural scientists. So there's a few social scientists, but they're in the minority. What they told us was that it was really useful for them to have a definition of what environmental social science actually was. From Access, because Access is a university initiative, ESRC funding and credibility, and it gave them visibility. We didn't have that definition before. It helps us to speak to professionals inside our government agencies and arm's length bodies, and it comes from a program with resonance and weight and endorsement, which you wouldn't have if you just tried to save yourself. So we've been triggering organizational change, cultural change, changing structures, recognition of people with useful skills, which wasn't really there very clearly before. And I mentioned the nature agencies, but other organizations that we've been working with include the Met Office. Really interesting journey, a very science-led body. One of our Leadership College fellows, Helen Roberts, is a Met Office employee. And so she's been working to create a social science function inside the Met Office. So suddenly the social scientists have a place to go, and they can convene, and they can share stories, and they can try and be more visible and useful across that institution. This is at our Leadership College, which I mentioned is that cohort of 20 early career researchers who come together for a retreat each year. Yeah, and it's just been a wonderful kind of initiative to be connected to and enable these young researchers to kind of grow. And many of them did not think of themselves as leaders in the beginning, but to become comfortable, to gain a sense of confidence that they might become leaders in the future. It was wonderful to be involved in. And then finally, as I mentioned, we have these assemblies. We had one last week. This is a quote from somebody, this is a couple of days after the previous one we had last year. And it kind of made me realize that actually a lot of the time academic conferences can be profoundly alienating experiences. And what does that say about us as a community? If people don't want to go to a conference, or they do and they find that they haven't spoken to anybody or they haven't felt included, it's all very cliquey, etc. So our assemblies are deliberately trying to break that mold and find places for people to have free conversations across disciplinary boundaries with people they didn't really feel they knew beforehand. That's not easy, but it's important. Yeah, Life After Access Director is something which we don't know the name of, but it will become clear in due course. Just to say that I'm also involved in other research activities still. Particularly, I would mention the ESRC-funded Governing Sustainable Futures project, which is about conflict and contestation. And it's based in Devon, using Devon as a lab. And you can find out more about it there. That is more than enough for me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Patrick, for a great talk. Yeah. Time for questions. One of you.
Thanks much, Patrick, for actually a lot of stimulation. Something really resonates with my work, and as a psychologist now, I'm wondering if it's about me, but it is about conflicts. And the narrative we are hearing in our own institution, so I'm a bit obsessed by Exeter as an ecosystem of relations. I've seen, as a professor in sustainability and circular economy, the narrative shifting, you know where I'm going, right? Into, the geopolitics, climate change, come on, it's an old news. So I'm politicizing a little bit. I feel like conflicts is a way of connecting with scholarship that matters.
Yes.
I don't know your experience, but I've never seen a work around biodiversity or climate change not connected to the human element, to the social element, and conflictual views about that. So,
Yeah.
how much of that would inform the future of your research landscape?
Yeah. So I'll get out my crystal ball, right, and we'll look at the future. But I think, I mean, it's in some senses, you're looking at somebody who has been researching conflict for all of their academic career in a way. What we've learned in the Governing Sustainable Futures project in particular is that certainly public sector institutions at the moment are really, really wary of conflict, particularly in an age of social media. So what they tend to do is to shy away from it and try and pretend that it isn't happening. They disengage. But of course, that doesn't actually address problematic issues at all. It's a kind of form of denial. So what we do need to do, I think, as academics, is try and come up with ways to help them engage directly with conflict. And in fact, and you know, it'd be interesting to discuss how far you can go with this, but of course there is an entire point of view within political science called agonism, which says that there is a lot of value in openly contesting things and recognizing that there will always be contestations over values or goals. And actually bringing that out into the open can be really helpful in moving beyond the existing situation where you presume that there isn't any conflict at all because we all believe in growth or whatever it is we all believe in. And just moving into a situation where we can tolerate differences between different stakeholders rather than continually thinking that it can only be done this way or you're either with us or you're against us, which is very divisive. So I think that there are lots of useful ideas we can bring to bear in this space. I also think that there's a thirst for useful ways to think across our society. You know, across our university structures, I can see Claire's got her hand up there. I think the tipping points idea is really interesting. I don't do any research on tipping points, but I think it's been really, really effective in galvanizing communities of practitioners, for example, because it offers a way to come together. People like something that is inclusive and brings belonging, and it's potentially positive, hopeful as well, which people really need. It's a very depressing time or area to be kind of interested in. So, but I think there are other ways of mobilizing around that too, not just that particular theme. So, coming back to your question, I think there are ways that we can bring conflict into the kind of discourse we have, but to use it effectively and not shy away from it. But that involves a starting point which is political from the outset. And I do think one of the issues we've had with a science-led agenda is that science tends to present itself as objective, distanced, uninvolved in the process, not political at all, quantitative, etc. And you know, I don't want to get into disputes with any scientists. I think that's wonderful. But if you're a social scientist, then that's a very problematic starting point. And that might be one of the reasons why policymakers have favoured talking to scientists in the past, because they think of social science as political. But at the end of the day, sometimes we need to use those ideas if we're going to get anywhere. And there's an increasing openness to doing that. Anyway.
So we have one question for Alex, and then we'll move to Claire and Natalia online.
Yeah, and I'll try and be shorter in my answer.
It was a quick question for me. I was interested by your characterisation of Environment Agency and Natural England as nature agencies. I mean, they're just regulators and DEFRA agencies. They don't call themselves nature agencies, do they? And
they do to us. We have the NASOM, the Nature Agency Social Research Network. So that's what that lot have told us that they call themselves. Yeah, they call themselves the nature agencies. But it may just be a label. But that's the umbrella term they use, because in particular we've engaged with their social research network, Pete Bailey and Beth Brockett and people like that. So yeah. I mean, it might not be their official name, but it's what they use themselves to come together and share useful knowledge.
Claire, listen to you online.
Hi, Claire.
Yeah, hi. So I have to leave.
The pictures too much.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, go for it.
Oh, great. Okay, I have to leave at 2 sharp, so I'm sorry. It's going to have to be a quick question and a quick answer. I suppose I'm really, yeah, thanks so much for your talk, Patrick. You know that your work resonates quite a lot with some of the stuff I've been working on. One of the things I'm really starting to get interested in is changes over time in discourses and the shape of tactics that people concerned about the environment use. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about how one does that, given that most research grants are sort of like 5 or 6 years max if you're lucky enough to get a big European grant, and whether you've noticed any sort of temporal changes in the characters of the discourse for and against energy infrastructure over the years. So I suppose it's 2 questions. One is, how do you do the process of a kind of like long trend, kind of like long trend line research, and have you, through projects that have taken place over time, noticed any of those changes? And I don't think I've got time to hear your answer, so we'll just have to meet up and have a chat.
Okay. Okay, well, very briefly then, Claire. I mean, I think the very longitudinal temporal research is really, really difficult. We know that funders don't typically want to know about that. It maybe comes back to some discussions we were having earlier about sustaining relationships with research partners over time, and then hoping that a funding opportunity comes up that you can fasten that into. So I think some of this is about, if we're a civic university, what does that mean? Are we cultivating and maintaining our relationships so that we can do, you know, we are ready to go if and when resources become available, and maybe we just get a bit more cute about finding resources from unusual places like philanthropy or whatever that may not be as short-term focused as UKRI. Coming back to the temporality, yeah, it's been really interesting. Keir Starmer has been talking a lot about the blockers. I don't know if you've heard about the blockers. They're people who stop new housing being built or growth happening. And if you just substitute NIMBYs for that word, it's exactly the same argument. So NIMBYism is really interesting. It's a word that was really prevalent in our media culture 20 years ago. It's still to some extent, but it's evolved with a slightly different term, but it's exactly the same assumption. So I think looking at it across time, sometimes you see change the language, but the underlying assumptions haven't really moved on at all, so they're still problematic, and they still need to be contested by academics where appropriate in our public discourse.
Thanks for your quick answer. Bye, everyone.
Okay, we're running out of time, but we'll take one last question from Natalia.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for your talk, Patrick. That's really interesting. It seems that a lot of people are resistant because they don't like the idea of change, and they want to keep their environment and their place the same. Do you think it'd be useful? So there's currently a big petition to have the People's Emergency Briefing on mainstream channels. So I just wondered what your maybe I should type it. Yeah, I just wondered what your thoughts were about the role of sort of public education in making people a bit more open to change. If you make people realise things are not going to stay the same either way, because maybe a lot of people just don't realise that that's not an option. Thanks.
Yeah, I don't know, Natalia. I'm quite uneasy about some of the things you're floating there. People don't like change. I mean, you could easily pick examples like smartphones, for example, which didn't exist. You know, I'm old enough now to remember when digital watches came in. Now we're talking about artificial intelligence in ways that were completely unimaginable. So I think sometimes you can have very rapid change in society. And to some extent, maybe as academics, we're maybe a little bit behind what's actually going on out there sometimes. But I think the danger with the whole public education thing is that it becomes yet another kind of top-down, you know, we know best. And I think in energy terms, that's been a consistent disaster, really. I would say disaster is a bit too strong, but you know, society isn't involved, for example, that no one in our communities decided that net zero by 2050 was a really useful target to set. A very small number of people in Westminster came up with that idea. So what we need to do is to connect those levels and make them resonant with communities. And that, I think, has not been there. So we do need, obviously, strategic policy making at the national level. But we also need to have ways of having local conversations which aren't just top-down conversations, but they're conversations which peter back up again. Community energy, for example, always seemed to be a bit of a no-brainer, so that you have a net zero target of energy transitions, but you have community initiatives which make that real in the local area and is useful and beneficial for local communities. So I think there are ways of joining up, basically, when I'm saying national and local spaces and political agendas, which maybe are ways of having those difficult conversations. I think you're getting at, Natalie, that, you know, if you prevent the wind from coming, climate change is coming anyway, and how do you have those kind of conversations? And I think there are loads of useful social science pieces of research which tell us about initiatives in other countries where they stitch together actors in useful ways. So if you look at the Access Task Force report on net zero, you'll find interesting things there about the value of intermediary bodies which work between the local and the national, for example, community groups, and convene spaces where people can come together and work through what climate change means in a local manner. So I think there are ways we can do this better than we are at the moment. It's just not been a priority. We've anesthetized local government, local context, but we can undo that, and maybe with new leadership we will. Thinking about the Labour Party.
Thank you so much. Sorry, we're gone over time, but thank you.